name is Dean Skolkin. Currently, I am the imaging manager at St. Luke's Health System in Boise, Idaho. I've been in clinical engineering for 37 years. Started in the Air Force, and I've been at varied places. Longest tenured job was at Philips Healthcare, to where I ran a contract with LA County Department of Health Services for 8 years. It was imaging and biomed, and I basically did everything at that account, and he was my service sales solution person. So we're here to talk about contracts and trying to do insourcing with, yes, Benzing?
I was trying to understand your job responsibilities based on your title there. It seems that you are field forces. It's hard to understand by the word manager.
Medical equipment imaging services.
Do we have a typo?
Oh, man.
In a
See,
major?
I knew Benzing would try and find something. All right. So, yes, we'll correct that. Thank you, Benzing. Appreciate it. We've been over these slide decks
We stared at him for
probably
so long.
25, 30 times and just never picked that up.
Spell check didn't get that.
But currently part of my job at St. Luke's is to move our services in-house. We are front loaded with service agreements, full service agreements, almost all of our imaging equipment. So they brought me in to do two things. One was to be strategic in thinking and how to leverage our relationships with our vendors to reduce our contract structure, and the other was to do technology management on imaging equipment. So, the agenda for today, we're going to be understanding contracts, analyzing the data, building contract structures, managing and assessing agreements, negotiating agreements, establishing KPIs. And this is going to be something that's important to me. Managing OEMs and vendors, how to hold them accountable. Talk about a little bit about point of sale contracts. Is it an option? Managing fleet technology, and then how make rights help construct contracts. Okay.
Real quick for go on, is there anything, does this kind of match what everyone's expectation was when they decided they would get up in the morning and come sit down here? Yes, no, is there anything we're missing? If there is, I mean, if we don't touch on it, we'll make sure there's room for questions at the end, but please interrupt us at any time. This is really a back and forth.
How large is
St. Luke's is an 8-hospital system in southern Idaho and southwestern Idaho. We cover Boise, Twin Falls. We have 5 rural hospitals and then 3 major medical centers. And then we have 300 clinics. So we have over 40,000 medical devices on our inventory. Is that right, Ryan? We're over 40 now? And I work with Mr. Walker and Mr. Chuma sitting there by Benzing. So go ahead and move the slide.
Yeah,
Ryan.
we are.
Oh, okay. So let's talk about understanding contracts, and data is knowledge. So when Brian and I constructed this slide, we really want people to understand when you're looking at your contracts, you need to have data from your performance of your equipment to be able to look at what you have in the contract and compare it against performance, right? So, we're looking at, do you understand the complexity and the details of your contracts? Because the contract's got stuff buried in there, folks, that you may not be aware of. Okay, there are specific things like, in-service training for users. Are they doing remote services? 24-hour monitoring of your systems. So you need to understand what's in the contract so you can understand what the value of that contract is. So when you go to assess it, what is the most appropriate data needed to initiate this process? I can't tell you what the most important data is. That's going to be up to you because it's your contract. So you need to identify what that data set is going to be, establish some measures with it, and some what we'll talk about later, KPIs, so that you can make sure that you're analyzing your contract for effectiveness. You know, how does the service vendor price their agreement? Brian, I'm going to leave that one up to you.
You know, it's a combination of, depending on the OEMs or if it's an independent service organization, it's going to be based on their labor. It's going to be based on their ability to get parts. It's going to be based on the market need. It's going to be on the cost of the equipment. It can vary dramatically. Also, it'll vary by your particular geographic market. Where are you and how is your vendor staffed? So you have to, these questions are really meant to kind of get us kicked off and started thinking, and we're going to answer them as we go through. But you have to think about, and then it's also the competitive nature of it. From a sales perspective, if I'm selling or positioning a service contract to someone, I'm also curious about who am I competing with. If I'm an OEM and I'm competing against independent service organizations, okay, it's going to be more of a price war, or it might be more of a quality issue. If I'm competing against an in-house organization, I'm going to answer some of these further questions. You know, what kind of training, what kind of influence is the customer going to have over the language of my agreement? Do they have a contracting department? You know, I'm thinking about that steps and steps ahead. So,
to me, the last one is very, very key, and how and when to hold performance review meetings. We hold them quarterly with our vendors, and it's a business meeting. And this is not just a review of our service agreement and the performance of it. It's a total overview of our relationship with the vendor and how we can work with them closely to monitor situations that affect our contracts and hold them accountable for that. But it's also about holding them responsible for their portion of our relationship.
And the relationship isn't just come in, let the vendor throw up a bunch of data and ask a few questions. It's bring your own, as Dean said very early on in the presentation already, bring your own needs and desires and what's going on. Also, go back to, if this is a original equipment manufacturer, a reseller of equipment, what quote unquote deals do they have going on within the organization? What capital are they selling? What equipment or services are they providing in other places? Keep that in mind while they're there so that you can leverage that. And we'll go into that at a later slide.
Garnering that information, especially that from the capital side, many of you, I know Steve and Isabella and Benzing understand this, is that when you identify the future business, then you're able to identify the future opportunities for your in-house departments.
Because I can guarantee you the OEMs are looking at you as an organization as a whole. They're looking at what equipment, what services, and by services, I could mean disposables, what kind of ongoing contracts you might have. If you look at large organizations like GE and Siemens, for instance, they're in many departments and they're providing a lot of different services across your ecosystem. They look at you that way, so you should look at them that way.
Mm-hmm. You know, next is analyzing the data to support your decisions financially and clinically. So one of the things that our organization was into was doing replacement of equipment as it fails. Fix, break, fix mentality of replacement, okay? Something we're trying to move off of so we can have planned capital replacement cycles. But it took me pulling mounds of data for a year to get them to understand that they were spending money that they didn't need to spend, okay? And so you need to be able to pull your performance information out of your databases and analyze it. Mean time between failure of devices, even down to major components, mean time between failures on tubes, detectors, other specialized components, so that you can make appropriate decisions and discuss the data with the vendor as you're analyzing the performance of your contract. Because I found one contract that we have tubes and detectors on. Okay, I got 13 cath labs with this vendor. The last 10 years, they have full coverage on detectors and full coverage on tubes. 2 detectors, 1 tube in 10 years.
So it goes back to fleet what is your fleet? What is your usage? What's your utilization? So you have to work with your clinical teams to say, are all those 13 rooms in Dean's example being used 24/7? Oftentimes they are, and it's critical, but oftentimes they're not. So is there redundancy in your system based on the technology and the locations of where those in this example, where those labs are, to see, is there some flexibility in the service contract coverage and therefore the pricing? And
So
how you can balance your risk.
So how many of you are in management in this room? How many of you ask your vendors to supply you an annual report on your service agreement going back for 5 years on the equipment history?
Yeah. Oh, you ask. And what do you get when you ask?
Yeah, and you need to have it structured. Yeah. You have to have it structured the way you want the data pulled. Okay. I beat heads with my vendors over this, sent them a spreadsheet to do it. They did it their way. I sent it back to them and said, do it mine. I'm your customer. This is the way I want it done. And what came back was the stuff that I found on tubes and detectors. You have to look at the utilization of major components and the uptime of the equipment, compare it against what your services are, because in the end, going back to the other slide, it's all about how you're going to reflect your clinical operations and your revenue outcomes, not the fixing of the equipment. That's just the daily things we do. So strategically, when we're looking at things, we want to see what our impact is to the clinical application side and the uptime with the equipment, and how much revenue they're either deferring or losing when the equipment's down.
I'm sorry, was there a question on the other side? I wasn't sure if I saw a hand. Okay, I got it.
Sure.
How are you also taking a look at what you guys can cover in-house versus what you need to call them out?
Absolutely. I spent the year that I talked about spending and digging that data led to an intense business plan for medical imaging, to where we identified a potential reduction in service agreement costs of $12.5 million over the next 5 years.
Based on what you cover in-house?
That is correct. And scaling our services down from full service, using the vendor and getting trained, okay, and then finally taking it in-house fully as much as possible in 5 years. Because beyond that, then it exponentially grows on the back end. Okay.
And there's there's a slide that comes up a little bit more, but great question. Great question.
Yes. That's a great question. Okay. It's going to depend on your organization. Mine, on our high-end equipment, the one thing that they have done on our MRs and our CTs, which are with Siemens, is they bought Evolve coverage. So our MRs and CTs are being maintained and upgraded every 5 years, which is something that I think is appropriate for some organizations, not necessarily all of them. You have to make that decision yourself, okay? But our agreement with them also says that as long as we have contract coverage with them at a minimal basis, okay, as a shared service agreement, expert type agreement, I know they're changing it now, we still can get the Evolve coverage. So it's about partnering with your vendor also. Okay?
And it's a dynamic situation, right? Equipment ages, new equipment comes in. Are you sunsetting the old equipment appropriately? It's that fleet management that you have to maintain on a regular basis to see, has that service model changed? Has the technology creeped away from your staff, and can you get them back up to speed, or is it better to go more full service at that particular time?
And actually they charge, we charge, since the Evolve type services or continuity with GE or whatever you want to call them, okay, we pay for those out of clinical engineering, even though it's a capital thing that they separate out of the contract. We pay for it, and then we track what those are so that we can help schedule those upgrades at the right time that we want them done. And we do it through project management at that time.
Is there another question on this side? Yeah.
Yeah, Benzie.
You push very hard on your vendors. How hard can you push or have you been able to
You know,
Oh, on the clinical side.
For example, utilization. Do you have documented utilization of equipment? Cases of accidents and abuses of equipment that resulted in damage, etc.
it's a great question, Benzing. It's one we are working on at our organization. At first, the organization has what is called a term of vendor-friendly policies. They don't like to push the vendor very much, okay? However, they've learned in the last year and a half that they have to, especially with a lot of the supply side issues that we're having and deliveries as service. You know, the vendors are there as an opportunity to help us as much as possible. Clinically, our people are starting to understand and try to get their hands around what the effects are of equipment utilization. We're not quite where I want us to be. I don't expect us to be there for another 18 months, Vincent. But it is something that we need to do. We need to understand our utilization, especially when systems are down, so that we can identify what those revenue deferment opportunities are and what those revenue loss opportunities are. And if something is taking more than 48 to 72 hours, who's stepping on the gas pedal with the vendor to get second level support in to start, or even the factory to come in and start taking a look at the problem. We had some issues with a vendor earlier this year to where they delayed and cost us severely, and we took them to task over it. We escalated all the way to their senior management before we finally got results. And sometimes, folks, you have to leverage those opportunities with your vendors. If they are not performing, don't let them just sit there and non-perform. It'll cost you money, and it cost us money, and they ended up making some make rights to us, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah. The bottom portion of this slide was kind of the world I lived in for 7.5, 10 years, somewhere around there. Again, everything on that contract is negotiable. It just depends on how hard you as a customer wish to push. So if you have a contracting department, if you have a legal department, get them involved, ask them to look at this and marry up your KPIs as a department and as a healthcare organization and as the utilization side, the clinical side, marry that up for something that doesn't make sense necessarily in the contract terms. At the very minimum, if you can't get it changed for whatever reason, because the vendors, depending on your market, again, might be in an extremely competitive situation. They might be able to bend. But at the same time, if you don't, well, now they know that you're looking under every rug, every corner. You're doing your due diligence, and they're going to be a little more heightened with you. So when it comes back to the data coming.
And it's not about necessarily, a lot of times they'll say they can't. That's not necessarily the case. They don't want to. Okay, you got to ask the question. You have a question back here?
Yeah. So, similar, you're doing it.
Oh, good.
Our issue is who owns the contracts, because vendors are very good at bypassing the HDM and going directly to.
No, it's my job, or it was my job. Sorry,
Yeah,
I do something else now, but
it was my job when I was with Phillips for 11.5 years working with him. Was we didn't want to go to the clinical engineering department. We wanted to go to contracts and grants in LA County.
I'll tell you, we want to, as a salesperson, put that hat on. We want to go to the least path of resistance, and we want to know who our influencers are, who are our decision makers, and we want not just because, I mean, it's not an adversarial situation. I mean, I know it feels that way, but we're looking for the quickest path to the deal. Okay, but we also know that if someone like Dean is there, who is extremely diligent, or yourself, I'm sorry, what's your name? Rodney. You know, you sound like you're very diligent. You know, it's taking 7 years because you got to move the needle slowly. It takes time. We know you are involved in the process, and to try to go around you will eventually hurt us. So I'm sorry, but I don't think we got to the crux of your question yet.
Well,
I think you were saying you own the contract.
We own the contracts, okay?
Because there's an old saying out there that says, you know, hospital is nothing for 1,000 cases.
Oh, never heard that.
But it's, you know, a lot of that clinical department owns the equipment, right? They want to hold the contracts. So then you end up with owners of the contracts. So it's hard to find who has all the contracts. This is what I've been doing for the last 7 years. Where these contracts are. And then nobody can really manage it. Well, since we took over managing their contracts, we don't own them. We just try to grab them. We have found tons of equipment that was under contract. That have been in the hospital.
Well, the short answer to that, then I'll go backwards, and Dean probably has an opinion too, is if they weren't doing anything, go get your money back.
Yep.
Okay, that's number one. And that's reasonable. That's the key word here in service, right? Reasonable, and it's a legal term too. But who owns the contract? You could say it's clinical, you could say it's the financial, you could say it might be a consortium of a group, like as you're discussing here.
So,
But I think you have to, I always go to the money. Who's paying for it? And who's
Supply chain.
responsible for the margin? I'm sorry.
the way we're set up is supply chain owns the relationship with the vendor, period. Everybody in the organization understands that. We still get the behind the scenes stuff that happens with the physicians and trying to buy equipment and stuff, okay? We're not perfect. But the way we have it set up is we have a contract management group in our supply chain division that works closely with our capital, and then they work closely with us in clinical engineering. So we're the gatekeepers of the contracts. We have a person who manages those contracts, works with supply chain on renewing. Anything new that comes in for imaging equipment comes across my desk. If it's for biomed equipment, it goes across Ryan's desk, okay? So that there's an influencer in the decision in making technical decisions with the users. So we go to the table with our clinical staff. I go to the table and talk about contracts with my imaging managers all the time. And they are becoming very supportive. We've turned things the corner and they're becoming very supportive of tracking us to move services in-house as much as possible, where it makes sense. Don't go grabbing linear accelerators and taking them off the contract, folks. Or mammography, you're going to run into problems with those folks. You got to establish the relationship, manage the relationship, and then move it forward and get their support.
I jumped ahead to the next slide, but I think we've already covered most of these.
Yeah, Isabel.
Is there a workflow that you have in place? Because on the hunting side, we're smaller, so we're pretty much set.
Right.
Very much involved with purchasing, so I do have that comment as well. But on the Cedar side, because it's much bigger, we're kind of working through that. And your question, it's the clinical engineering, it's supply chain, it's the the clinical department, because that's where the money is. We're on the same wavelength where you're the users of the equipment, your cost center is going to absorb the cost, but they're not the ones from an administrative standpoint to be managing it. They're not negotiating. They're not looking at that's us and actually supply chain as well, because in supply chain we happen to have some assignments.
Is Tony still there running supply chain? You have a great advocate in Tony.
Which is wonderful, but sometimes it's like, where do you cross the line? Who does what, right? Because sometimes Tony.
So to answer your question, our workflow it's in transition right now, to be honest with you. I would say we're probably about 75, 80% where we want to be. There's still the excuse me, onesie twosie things that happen that we end up dealing with on the back end. But mainly our major vendors, especially for imaging, have been notified. You have a contract proposal, it goes to our contracting department and supply chain management. Supply chain brings it to me for review, okay? I work with our users saying, I got this contract. Here's where I think we can go with this. They approve it. We have what is called an image community of practice. So I bring some of this to the imaging community practice if it affects the whole system, or if it's individualized, I go to each of the individual facilities. We make a decision, we go back to contracting and say, this is what we want. And then they go back to the vendor and say, no, we don't want a point of sale service agreement, or we don't want full service, here's what we want. Then they bring it back to us. That is our current process. There's some things that need to improve with it. Yes, sir. What was it?
How do you value the technology, upgrade yourself?
Depends. The vendors will be happy to, well, I shouldn't say the vendors, the OEMs, they're trying to be innovative. They're always trying to come out with something new. You know, it's going to be faster. It's going to have better image quality. It's going to give, if we're looking at diagnostic imaging, it's going to give the radiologist more confidence, you know, et cetera. Because everyone's being measured to death these days, right? You have to take the there's no easy way to do this, but you have to take the marketing material and then go back to the clinical teams and say, what are you measuring, and see where they align. Because everyone says it'll be better, faster, and it's going to cost this much and it'll pay for itself. You've got to break that down from a business perspective. If they say that throughput on a particular piece of equipment, whether imaging or what have you, you're going to get the same information or better, faster, we'll have them prove it. Was there a white paper? Was there a study done? Put a spreadsheet together for me. Have the vendor do that for you. Say, this is our casework, this is our volume, this is what studies we do, and then line it up with the clinical team and see if those things come together. But it's some spreadsheet work. And then, you know, again, what's your budget? You know, as Dean said earlier with the CT example, sometimes that makes great sense. In my current role, I work for an AI company that does neurodegenerative analysis with MRI. We take something that was manual, we make it automated. We have proven case studies that show that you used to do X number of patients, you should now be able to do Y, and there better be an improvement there, and you better have confidence in it. And it's harder if the customer hasn't been upgrading their MRI. The scans take longer. So again, depending on the technology and the clinical space you're in. So I know I'm doing this with your answer. I'm kind of going. Yeah. Oh.
That's a tough question to answer because I'm going to be honest with you, vendor can't even answer that question.
They'll be the first to tell you that we believe we're going to do X number of updates. So it's one of those, past performance is not indicative of future, but that's all you've got to go on. So what has this vendor or OEM done for you, done for this system or this type of piece of equipment? What have you done to date? They've had one update over 3 years, but you want me to wrap it into the service contract? I'm not seeing it. I'll just pay CapEx for it. I'll pay capital out of my capital budget when it comes time. I mean, but if they're constantly pushing updates, if they're helping managing your network on the back end with your IT people, they're providing some other value adds, probably a good idea.
And it depends on the type of upgrades that they're also providing, whether they're going to be billable to you or inclusive in your contract. So you need to have them spell that out for you, because a lot of times they won't. Exactly.
Yes. Well, and it goes back to the clinical teams. I mean, I have a really cool tool, what I sell today, but not everyone buys into it. You know, they don't do that. They don't fully segment a brain. They don't have a need. So you have to, but doctors, again, I'm generalizing, love cool stuff. They do. You know, it's kind of like get them to justify, you know, why. Or you go back to the data that says, okay, you're not even doing this today. So get your marketing department involved. Well, are you going to have more referrals if you get this? It goes back to the revenue side of it. Yeah, it's a great question, but there's no easy answer.
So at the bottom of this, real quickly, the bottom of the slide is how do you monitor vendor performance? And you know, you're going to need to design your own methods and processes and systems, but who within your organization helps evaluate the vendor's effectiveness? Because you can't do it by yourself. You got to have your internal customers, the users, as part of that team. And you're also going to have your supply chain management people, because if there are performance issues, they're going to be the ones that are going to hold the vendor to the table. Oh, we got all this capital equipment we're going to buy from you, and you can't fix this? Really? Okay.
Ooh, we've got to thin the slides down. There's a lot of
Yeah, I
words.
know. It's about teamwork, and I think you guys can see, we've talked about the tubes and detector stuff and transducers, image intensifiers. How many of you have moved services on your systems from starting at 8 o'clock to maybe starting at noon and going until 9 or 10 p.m. at night? And Steve, how effective has that been? I'm looking at it.
It's an interesting conversation, because as soon as you move the time, right, that's something that it's focused on.
Mhm.
But we had ministries that wanted to move it just for the sake that, based on when FedEx arrives, right, and when parts arrive, logistically, there was
That's
no
a
way
good-
even for the parts to be available at the hospital by the time the contract time started.
That's a great
So
point.
we were paying for time that we weren't ever going to provide service. And so, adjust that. More often than not, our teams have adjusted to just adding later hours. And part of that is simply because if you have something that happens late, getting the vendor there as early as you can the next day is best to minimize operational.
So you guys take a look at your data and the fact of just shipping deliveries and everything to maybe reorganize the structure of your contract. And I think that's a great testament.
That's
It
a great
really is.
idea. I mean, you're looking at, especially if you're in a remote area where, like you said, the planes don't even land with the parts until X
We
time.
run into that in Boise all the time.
I'm sorry?
A remote area like Seattle.
Oh,
Let's
I was just using,
let's
I
talk
wasn't saying
about
you
my
were remote.
organization being remote in Podunk, Idaho.
Well,
I love it there.
We could discuss remote meaning what in Seattle,
But we have delivery issues with, and it's not the vendors that create the delivery issues most of the times, it's the shipping vendors.
Yeah.
And we have issues trying to get parts in by 11 o'clock. And so I've started looking at that, Steve, and going, well, if you're not available because you can't do the repair, what do I need you for from 8 o'clock until 11 o'clock? If 50 or 60% of my service is done after that time, what can we do to restructure?
Critical parts at your facility for you to have available when you need them. If they need them for somebody else, they can take them.
Absolutely.
and that's where I was going to go. The local depot. Every organization calls it something else. They either share a place with FedEx, UPS, DHL. They have their own. The local service manager should have some say in what parts are there. Doesn't mean that they get listened to by their organization.
Here's
By
the,
local depot, we mean our facility.
Oh, you mean your facility? So you worked it in.
try
And that's
not
where I was
using the
going.
word depot with the vendor. It
Yeah.
scares the living blazes out of them.
What I was going to
Local
get
part
to.
storage.
Yeah, exactly that. Have them define what local part storage is,
Yes.
and don't be afraid to go see it.
Or
And check the level of dust.
we've offered a couple of our
That's all.
vendors storage on site.
Yeah.
At our locations, at Meridian, we do that. We have a storage location for our major vendors to put stuff. We have, condensers for chillers. We're even getting a couple of tubes and some detectors that we're going to be storing high failure type parts that are major components. We've got what we call I would call a forward stocking location.
Steve?
So we also have some pretty rural locations, right?
Oh, yeah, you do.
Anchorage, Alaska, Toyota Fallon, right? Missoula, Montana, Medford, Oregon. And these are areas where there's geographical limitations, climate
Yes.
limitations, and those kinds of things. So when we have these conversations, we want to bring those pieces into it as well, because it's unlikely the vendors would typically depot stock or keep stuff in those locations. So working with them to front load some critical things that we can have available to us and to their teams if needed. If they have other local customers, they could use those same parts for those local customers, right? I mean, but
Yeah.
it starts with us.
It starts having the discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and being very upfront with it and forward about it. And sometimes there's what's the word I'm looking for? There's storage requirements of particular parts. They have to be kept at a certain temperature or medium. You know, it's kind of like wine. You can't have temperature swings that go too much. But if you can accommodate those for your vendor, there's an option. There was a hand over here. Oh,
yeah, right.
Years ago on the MRI with GE, most of our service, they were doing like 7 in the morning, 7 at night. During the day, over a 3-year period, our MRI had one part down. So over time, they get calls from service, they'll come in at night and do it, or they'll do the PMs at night, and then they bill the hospital. We had higher billables than the contract cost. So I got with GE and I said, I want my contract from 7 at night, 7 in the morning. Well, we can't do that. I don't have the staff. I said, who the hell does it at night anyhow? And we ended up rewriting that contract 7 at night until 7 in the morning. And over the next 3 years, we did a 3-year contract. We had 2 heart downs. And it cost us a little bit, but not much as it did before.
well, and that goes to the yin and the yang, right?
Yeah.
You have the Monday through Friday 8 to 5 or whatever coverage that you're going to catch 80% of your problems. But is it sometimes better to pay out of pocket for the one-offs that happen? And again, you got to go back to your history. You got to see what kind of delivery they have from a vendor perspective. Yeah. They're gonna use it until it. Yes,
So
it's unfortunate.
one of the key components here is at the bottom is, refine to build a master service agreement if it's appropriate. How many of you have master termed agreements with one termination date for all equipment?
From a vendor or for a particular modality, yeah.
So talk about leveraging volume.
Yeah.
Okay, and then cycling it all will save your organization and its own internal labor a lot more. Okay.
Real quick, for the next slide, yin and yang, right? You do that, you better be ahead of when that contract's coming due, because usually when you do that, you're at a 3+ year term. Everyone forgets about it, and then it's 90 days out, and you're scrambling, and the vendor knows they're all tied up with you.
Yep.
So it's now become a symbiotic relationship. So you have to start the renewal process, I would suggest 6 months out.
We've actually done it pushed it to where it's almost a year out.
Yeah. And
We
again,
get our first notification to grab our data.
yeah. And that saves your supply chain and your purchasing people a lot of time, just managing one document, but it also, again, tie it into that last bullet, leveraging your position. Is there equipment purchases happening at the same time? I will guarantee you, every equipment manufacturer, I won't use names, would rather sell. They make most of their money on service, honestly, but equipment sales drives the business. So if you know that a department is about ready to buy 10x of something, and you've got a nice big service contract coming due, trust me, they will do whatever they can to make sure that capital sale goes through, including dropping the price on the service if they have to. They don't want to work together, but they have to. There's some questions.
That bullet right there, additional education, you're talking about training for in-house.
Yes, and it can also be clinical staff. So if you have a high level of turnover for your clinical tech or application team, sometimes the vendors will charge you. Okay, when you first buy it, you get a certain number of hours, certain number of classes or on-site visits. Then they want to charge you. So it's both. Moving for an in-house organization, you want to have flexibility, as Dean is doing, but you also want to make sure your clinical team is taken care of. If they have questions one-off, they have new staff, how can you address it?
So how can you do that with a master service agreement? Because if you have the singular contracts, every single piece of equipment has its own in-service education tied to the contract. So when you talk to the vendor about these issues, you need to talk about bundling of the training applications training, application support, remote support, because you're paying for that individually in individual contracts. And if you do master agreements, how much can that drive the price of the service agreement down if it's all bundled? Okay.
Well,
Go ahead.
one last question, quick.
Yeah.
Well, can you touch on varying contracts when you have
Varying contract? Varying contracts?
Linear accelerators.
That's a totally different animal to tackle.
Can we,
Okay,
can we put,
that's a sidebar discussion we can have.
can we do it at the end?
Okay, but it's a long discussion. We
Yeah.
can talk about it after this.
We won't leave, but we'll, no,
That,
you're-
that is an animal that I come with a tank with,
Yeah.
okay? Yeah, no, that's pretty much it.
this is your slide, Dean.
Yeah, establishing KPIs, and I'm not talking about KPIs for, for joint commission or regulatory compliance, folks. I'm talking about your vendor performance KPIs that you need to determine, and they need to be built into your contract as part of your service deliverables and expectations. Okay, so, what is the routine mean time between failure rate of all your MRIs? And part of those MRIs is, what were the big component failures that you had? Did you have an RF amplifiers or gradient amplifiers going out? Was it cold head issues? Was it chiller issues?
What time did the service call get placed versus them showing up
Yeah,
compared to the T's and C's of the contract?
Absolutely. Response time,
If it was-
on-site response time from the time the call's open. Different vendors write different performance standards. Is it 1 hour response by phone? How do you measure that? But making sure that they're to a level. Okay, there are occasions where they're going to call and say, do we need to be there within 4 hours? That's your call. But at least they need to be asking that question, and the user is the one that makes that call, not clinical engineering. Okay.
Real quick, the all vendors manpower, or our vendors manpower quantities and levels guaranteed. Kristen brought this up. I mean, she's involved in this world. Manpower for your vendors is tough, just like it's tough for you to find good people. So that's, as the market has changed and shifted over my career, that is where I might cut my vendors some slack, depending on how hard they're looking. If they say they're looking to hire people, there's one way to prove that they are or aren't. Go to their website and see if there's a job posting.
And
Go
how
to
many have you
LinkedIn.
seen decreased response times since COVID happened?
And help them. If you know someone who's interested but doesn't want to be an in-house person but likes the idea of being in the field, probably helps you on the backside. Yes, sir.
Considering everything is the same, what's the average cost of MRI contract?
Depends on the vendor.
Yeah.
Depends on the age of the technology, the vendor.
For your experience.
Your key, I can't give it to you because the key, he said at the first beginning, location.
It's going to be the location. So where are you, sir?
Loma Linda.
Loma Linda. Oh, okay. Yeah. So you're a big luminary site. They should be taking care of you, and they should be getting multiple quotes. Yep. So, and then again, depending on how new your equipment is, newer equipment will tend to service pricing. We've been toying with this, but I'll try to do it with my hands. Brand new system, right? Just come off the line, RSNA, big deal. Your docs want it, you're going to buy it. So there is no other source for service. You've got to go to the OEM.
Mhm.
That might be the time for a point of sale service agreement, because you don't really have a choice. Use the equipment sale to drive the service pricing down as far as you can. Over its time, the OEM, if they built something that people like, that pricing, if we're going time this way and dollars this way, it'll drive it. Competition will drive it down, right? Siemens will come. In your example, GE came out with something cool. Now Siemens did. Well, now they've got to compete. Then the independent service organizations, they pick it up. They have guys that'll take care of it. All right, now there's more competition. Now there's something new hitting the market. The one you have is old. Now the OEM wants to end of life it. They don't want to upgrade it anymore. So now the ISO has has a window of opportunity to kind of drive the price up a little bit, and then it's end of life and it just goes to zero because no one wants to touch it. So I can't give you a dollar amount, but that's the evolution of a service contract
And-
pricing.
And one vendor's
general.
service pricing on an MR will be different from another vendor's, to be quite honest with you.
I'm sorry. They used to, the rule of thumb used to be 8% of the
Yeah.
cost of the equipment. It's really more what will the market bear? I hate to be that
I
economic on
measure
you,
it,
but
but I
it's
don't
really
use it
that.
as a finite measure. I use it as an eyeball type
And-
of perspective.
MD byline is sometimes a good reference for you. I'm sorry? Say again? Yes,
Agree. Yep.
thank you.
Based on,
Right. But no one's litmus testing it. You know, a customer can and upload that and they can honestly say whatever they want. I mean, because they can't give them the contract because that's quote unquote
Let me
proprietary.
ask you this, how many of you have group purchase organizations that
that's
you're
another good
using at
example.
your organization, Steve?
GPOs.
Most of you. You need to work with your supply chain management people because those GPOs, most of them already have agreements with the vendor for pricing on the service agreements. I caught a vendor selling us 8 large modality systems, and the service contract price discount, they sold them a point of sale service agreement to lessen the capital of 3%, and the service agreement discount was 5. When the agreed upon pricing with the GPO was 38%. They lost 33%. And when I pointed it out to them, all of a sudden, the discussion about point of sale service agreements changed a little bit. And they went back to the vendor and said, don't do that again. You got to watch that.
Real quick, sir. This gentleman's been waiting for a while. I'll come back.
Just real quick on how successful or effective are you on the vendor financial?
Here, sales hats on. I learned over the years that whatever I'm going to reimburse you for is never going to cover the cost of all the manpower that was wasted from a clinical standpoint or the reimbursement of that patient, not even to mention the care that was maybe delayed and caused harm. So it's more of a penalty back to the equipment or the service provider because they're going to have to write a check because that's not a simple process. I mean, these companies are put in place to make money, not to give you money. So I would use it more as a penalty of you didn't meet your obligations. That's one of 3 strikes that gets me a chance to cancel the contract if I want to. You didn't, or you know, from a financial perspective, honestly, it's more of a headache. When I worked for an OEM, sold a contract, didn't meet an obligation, I got to go through 16 approvals, but the actual dollar amount was a drop in the bucket to us. So I would look at it more from a metric negotiation standpoint.
Because you're not going to you will not get a vendor to reimburse you for lost revenue. Period.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
zero.
I mean, it's standard boilerplate stuff. You can increase it a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's still not going to get you back whole. Yeah.
If it's severe enough, that's where you need to be working with your legal department on either canceling the service agreement or forcing renegotiation of your service agreement
Or some
to-
kind of make right.
as a part of the make right. Okay. And we'll talk about make rights here in a second, but establishing KPIs is big thing. Oh,
I just have one quick question. What kind of window is like a point of sale? Like how long do you have to?
it's at sale. That's why it's called a point of sale
It's
agreement.
it's at the equipment sale. Sometimes they'll give you during the warranty period of the equipment, but most of the OEMs have scaled that back. They want it at the time of booking.
Yeah. And
That's
understand
our term of we've closed
if
the
they
deal.
extend warranty to 2 years, that's a misnomer. Okay. They're billing you for the second year as part of the purchase agreement on the.
And they have
piece
to
of
tell you.
equipment. Yes, they do.
It's in the agreement.
Yeah, what we do for the CT MRIs, if they're down for more than 48 hours, that vendor is obligated to bring in a mobile unit.
There you go.
There you
That's
go.
one I never even thought about.
I've had to write those in, then make sure, call the vendor, ask who are they bringing in? Is it their own system? Is it someone they're partnering with? Call that partner, have them explain how quickly they can actually get one to you. And because the OEM isn't, or the service provider is not going to call you, not going to call for that mobile until the 48-hour, 1-minute mark.
Right.
And then is there another delay? And there was one more question over here, then we're gonna jump.
That's,
My crystal ball is hazy on that.
yeah, that's another side discussion. I think it needs to occur, but probably not here because it's a supply side issue discussion, not contract. But
It's tough. It's a
the
good,
main point is, develop key performance indicators.
oh, I'm sorry.
Make sure that they're smart. Okay, we all know about SMART being specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound. And make sure that you're protecting your organization with the correct contract language about KPIs and performance as much as possible. You're not going to be perfect at it. You monitor these things, and if certain KPIs work, great. Or if they fix a problem and then the problem is fixed, do you really need that to be continuously monitoring that KPI? Okay, change them up on the fly.
Point of sale, I think I hit most of these.
Yeah.
And this is, again, from a sales perspective to you, my customer, I have more pricing flexibility the longer the term.
Right.
Now, does that work for you? A lot of organizations say, we don't do anything longer than 3 years. The next thing, if I was a salesperson, okay, I'll give you the second, or the 2 years, the last 2 years of the 5-year agreement as an option year. Okay, guarantee the price in there. So then you have an option to easily renew it or extend it. That helps supply chain departments too. I mentioned tying it to the capital equipment, the data we talked about, contracts, benefits again, the benefits. I mean, there's all kinds of things we can do on the service side, because now it becomes an operational cost to your department or to you or your clinical team rather than a CapEx. For contract.
Yeah,
I think we touched on most of this,
Yeah,
but again,
touched pretty much.
I'll be happy
everything
to
on point
stick
of
around.
sale.
We're getting towards the end.
Yes.
Oh, so fleet technology management. This we could spend a whole hour on ourselves.
Yep.
This is an ever evolving process. Someone mentioned they bought it, they've been servicing it, no one's touched it, or that hasn't even been in the hospital for years. Again, this is not a personal issue. Nurses love to, I love X. You bought all of these. I'm going to put these in the closet and I'm going to use these all the time. And they don't tell you. You still have to service it. You still have to find it. So it's an ever evolving process. And it goes back to the gentleman that asked the question, I think he left, about software and upgrades. How long are you holding on to it, and what is too long? You know. Oh yeah.
I mean, that's different. You're looking at the life cycle. You have to get it. Well, when is it time to replace it? And vendors are pretty good at that, but some aren't. I mean, we could buy new ultrasounds and some companies that still Windows 7, and then that is an issue.
I'll give you an example. So I'll give you 2 examples. Dean he'll take the second one and run as soon as I say it. But the first one was when I was at Philips, we had a customer that had just a basic rad room, but it was running on a Sun Microsystems computer. Sun Microsystems does not exist anymore. Philips had not end-of-lifed the room, but obviously Sun, or the people who bought Sun, I forget who that was, end-of-lifed the server. Well, Philips had an end-of-life this. They had a service contract going out 2 more years. Hold them accountable for this. Don't let them say, well, that's end of life, I don't know what to do. I don't care.
It's your problem.
I pay you for this. And I was actually on the customer side on that one. I stood there toe to toe, and we found a vendor that actually rebuilt the whole server. Now, it took a month. So then, but that goes back to what it is. And then I'll say it, the Philips Cath Labs with Microsoft operating systems that all of a sudden snuck up on Philips, and oh, got to upgrade them, we can't service them, everything went to heck. That happens even at large multinational companies. Probably the theme we should consider here is you are not an island. Get your IT team involved early. Get your supply chain people involved early. Your purchasing, your contracting, your legal, your administrative, your clinic. It's a village, and have everyone just check a box. Yeah, it's got Microsoft, whatever. I don't know when that's expiring. I don't know when that needs to be upgraded, because the OEMs are going to tell you it's your fault or it's our fault, but you're never going to know until the rubber hits the road that day. So I'm sorry, Dane.
No,
kind of
I'm
hijacked
not
that.
going to impart my wisdom on that because
But it's
a tough discussion.
we'll make sure these slides are available, but this is kind of a good fleet
My
management.
understanding
Yeah.
is MD Publishing is going to make the slide sets available after the conference. Is that correct?
And what I think we're
This is the last slide.
Yeah.
So make rights. Everybody understand what a make right is. Okay, make right is any solution that the vendor is going to provide for you for a wrong they have committed to your organization. I don't care if it's comping of a service call that's billable and billable labor, that's a make right. All the way up to
equipment
replacement. And Brian and I went through a couple of those at Phillips when I was at LA County, specifically with a PET CT.
Everyone has them. Everyone makes mistakes. Trust me, nobody from a manufacturer or service provider decides to wake up and screw their customer.
Nope.
That's not their goal. But things get around them. People make mistakes. And again, leverage it.
It's working with the vendor and having, my thing is you have high level make rights. Those have to be with an account executive from the vendor, because they're going to be your advocate going to the upper levels of management in their organization to get approval to do big make rights.
Yep.
Okay. Understand what the make right is about, what your ask is, and work with the vendor to get the right solution. But accessing your account executive is going to be a key, because they're going to help you walk through that.
Question: if you came into a situation where your account executive isn't as responsive or receptive, who do you suggest that you?
Here, you can use this.
This escalate.
I call teasingly a BAT. It was a vendor attitude adjustment tool. Okay? And that can be anything from, we're going to cancel your service agreement, we're not going to do business with you, and we're going to debar you from doing business with our organization.
But you're jumping ahead. You're jumping ahead.
Yeah, I know.
Before you go there. They're probably trying to solve it at their local level, and they don't want to escalate it for some kind of visibility issue. There's nothing wrong with jumping ahead of their organization, going straight to the website, and if they're big enough, they're going to have a customer support advocacy. You fill out that form, send it. It might take a couple of days or a week. It will trickle its way from on high to the local people.
Stuff does slow down.
And have your C-level executive person send it.
Yeah. And
take the initial call and then have it sent to you. You will get, all it takes is, after this, we're not going to buy anything from X. Nothing tightens someone up than an executive of sales and revenue than that.
And that's the exact process I used with a certain vendor last year.
And then do what he said if you don't get what you want.
Service, I worked with the local service team to try and get service issues fixed. It didn't happen. They tripped over themselves and cost us in downtime for a week on a cath lab. I said, enough is enough. I contacted my account executive and then my C-level guy from supply chain. We held a meeting with the upper level of their service and sales organization. And we flat told them, you have 30 days to fix this stuff. I never saw a whole bunch of scrambling as I saw as this vendor all of a sudden trying to turn corners that they couldn't said that they just couldn't turn.
And 9 times out of 10, it's in the agreement already.
Yep.
Yeah.
So leverage your contract language and make sure if you have make rights, that you work with the company, with your account executives, but make sure you are working with your organization first and have a battle plan to put the vendor in a position to do what you want them to do.